Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Monday that his country has proof that Iran lied when it said it never pursued nuclear weapons. What does that development mean for the Iran deal?
Means it confirms what we said in 2007 when we said, if you recall the backdrop, in 2007, late in 2007, we published a controversial national intelligence estimate that said Iran had stopped its weaponization program. It's doing other stuff, the centrifuges, the missiles, and so on. But the task to actually build a weapon, we had evidence that they had stopped that work in 2003. And I was fond of saying then, and I'll say it now, this is in 2007 that we're making this judgment. This wasn't absence of evidence. This was evidence of absence, that they were no longer working on a program, the weapons program. And so what the Prime Minister's got is a bunch of evidence, and if I understand the story correctly, good on Israeli intelligence for grabbing the documents. But the documents just fill in the story that we and the Israelis had already been telling.
You write that you have not been a fan of the Iran nuclear deal, that the U.S. could have driven a harder bargain.
Right.
Does President Trump have the opportunity to do that now?
I don't know that the president can make the nuclear deal better. Iran is further away from a weapon with this deal than they would be without it, and we know more about the Iranian nuclear program with this deal than we would know without it. And so I am quite concerned if in early May we rip up the deal and walk away from it.
Yeah, because nothing happens in a vacuum. What would happen if the United States decided it wanted to withdraw from the Iran deal? For instance, you look at North Korea and the message that would be received there. What do you think that message would be?
Our first issue is not with the Iranians or the North Koreans. It's with the Europeans. I mean, this is not an Iranian-American deal. There are multiple parties that have signed, and that includes France, Great Britain, Germany, and the European Union as a whole. So the first thing we would be doing would be walking away from our allies. The second, we'd have to see what kind of response the Iranians might take. And frankly, if I were advising the Iranians, and I don't, I would tell them to do nothing for a while. I would advise them, let the transatlantic stresses put pressure on the Americans and the Europeans and see where that goes.
Because they actually have some leverage, perhaps?
Well, we'll see, because that will put, I think, will put the Americans and our European allies at one another, and the Iranians can kind of stand back, pretending to be the good scouts for a while. And then finally, the core of the question you asked, what does it do with the North Koreans? I think what it signals is these guys, the Americans, aren't reliable negotiating partners.
Does it send that message for the United States as a whole, or just this particular president?
Well, it says it for this particular administration.
How do you go about assessing a claim from South Korea that the North would give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a U.S. commitment not to attack?
Yeah, I'd have to see the fine print, and I'd have to hear that from the North Koreans. Again, quoting current intelligence officials, they actually point out that within their own logic, I mean, these people weren't crazy, but within their own logic, the North Koreans see the possession of these weapons as absolutely essential to regime survival. And so I find it very hard to imagine a scenario in which going to zero is any kind of near or even midterm goal.
So the reality of the United States' continued calls for denuclearization is what? Because what is the incentive for North Korea to do that?
I frankly don't know, and I hope I'm wrong, and I hope wiser people in government have a better plan. All right, but my sense at the end of the day, the happy outcome is a good meeting between the two presidents, a little bit more than a photo op, but somewhat ceremonial, and then they launch their two teams, knowing that, wow, we got a lot of work to do, and we put ourselves on a path that reduces tensions and maybe capabilities on both sides and increases transparency.
Could that just be running out the clock, though, for Kim Jong-un?
Well, you know, that's been President Trump's complaint, that the other administrations before him ran out the clock. They should have solved this problem. Now I've got to go solve this problem.
You call it a wicked problem.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, a wicked problem in which you have absolutely opposed interests. Look, if people like me and people in my background would say they're not crazy. Now, would be crazy if they gave up their weapons. And let me elaborate on that. I use a silly little metaphor. They've gone to the movies. It was a double bill. The first film was called Saddam Hussein. The second film was called Muammar Gaddafi. And the short subject in between was called Ukraine. Remember, the country that gave up its weapons for territorial guarantees in perpetuity? And so Kim is getting the sense, oh, I see what these people do to you if you don't have this. And, you know, for him, regime survival and personal survival are indistinguishable. And so I just find it very hard within any kind of coherent planning timeline we can actually expect to get to zero.
How much credit should President Trump get for getting the North Koreans to at least be open to some kind of dialogue?
President Trump did what I think any administration would do. And so he's actually embraced more risk with amping up the pressure on the North Koreans, with isolating them diplomatically, with amping up the economic sanctions, with a lot of military demonstrations. I think all of those kind of increase the torque on Kim and the Chinese.
And his rhetoric.
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
The rhetoric might be a little different, though. I think the rhetoric may have pushed us into a more dangerous place than we would otherwise. This is hard enough, all right? But the rhetoric, you know, Kim Jong-un didn't go to the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I mean, he's not all that experienced in this stuff. So we want this 30-something to decode rhetoric from the President of the United States and have this young fellow saying, well, he's just posturing. You and I had trouble figuring out what the president meant.
Fire and fury.
So imagine what it must have been like in Pyongyang.
And to people who say, though, it's precisely that kind of rhetoric that is something that we haven't necessarily seen from an American president that could very well be responsible for getting Kim Jong-un to perhaps be more open.
You know, I've got to admit of the possibility, but then I'd suggest there may be a reason why no other president's spoken that way, and then I might suggest it's the other stuff. The no-fooling show of military force without the chest thumping, the economic isolation, the diplomacy, the sanctions, and so on.
You say your book is not an effort to build a case for collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Was that information sort of weaponizing or the information warfare that we now know is happening or has happened, was that something that during your time at the CIA there were voices perhaps raising that as a possibility? So
I tell the story in the book that I became the commander of something called the Air Intelligence Agency in the mid-1990s. And the Air Force is on the cutting edge of the cyber thing. And we actually had a theological debate down in San Antonio. It was, are we in the cyber business or are we in the information business? Now, cyber, computer network attack, exploitation, defense. Information, that's controlling the information space in which an adversary lives. And so we looked at both, and we kind of consciously made the decision, now we're over here. And of course, you know how it turns out. We have a cyber command. We don't have an information command. So we stuck with cyber dominance. And I tell the story in the book. The Russians went to door number 2. The Russians went to information dominance. The Russians did it first to their own population. They did it to us and the Europeans with the Crimea and the Donbass, the eastern Ukraine, creating this information bubble over what they were doing, so it was hard to figure out the little green men. And then about 2014, they took the show really on the road and began to mess inside the American information space. And by 2015, I think they made a decision, we can play in the election.
So given everything that you just laid out, how prepared was the U.S. intelligence community for the threat from Russia?
Totally unprepared. We never really thoroughly explored that the Russians may be over here in the information lens and be coming at us in an information dominant sense rather than in a cyber dominant sense. So they stole the DNC emails. That's not very sophisticated. But then what happened? What they did with the emails, Russian bots, RT, Sputnik, their white world broadcast networks, their agents of influence here inside the United States. That's more sophisticated.
Let's turn to President Trump's nominee to head the CIA now, Gina Haspel. She is under fire for her involvement in the agency's old interrogation program, and you co-signed a letter supporting her. What message would her confirmation send?
So, Gina is a wonderful officer, and I'm not the only one who signed it. All right, you have CIA officers, senior officers from the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations all saying, this is the best person to head the CIA now. All I can tell you is everything she did was viewed operationally relevant by the director, was authorized by the president, was termed legal by the Attorney General, and was briefed to Congress as we were doing it. You know, the title of the book, The Assault on Intelligence, Age of Lies. I have some concerns about how decision-making is done in the Trump administration. And my take, and all of us who signed that letter, our take is that the one person you want in that room when everyone else is going into north-south Autobob after the president says something that's probably not wise, the one person you want in that room is Gina Haspel, because she will not nod. And she will tell the president what she believes is the objective truth.